On the 31st of October 1858, the Day of the Dead came to the people of Bradford in West Yorkshire, as 20 people, including a number of children, were dead or lay dying, and a further 200 were suffering from severe arsenic poisoning within a 24-hour period. This is the Bradford sweet scandal, which was the largest mass poisoning in British history. Between the census of 1810 and 1910, Britain experienced probably the largest seismic change in society, as social, economic, cultural, transport and politics changed the nation beyond all recognition. By the start of the 1900s, 90% of the population had moved from predominantly rural to being urbanized and involved in non-agricultural pursuits. A city-based workforce relied on consuming food rather than growing it for itself. For most of Queen Victoria's reign, food and medicine were largely unregulated commodities. You could go to any shop and purchase opium or arsenic products without signing the poison register or even giving your age. In order to make sweets of any kind, you need sugar. Until the advent of growing sugar beet in England, it all had to be imported from overseas. It had become available throughout the country by the 1400s, but it was horribly expensive, and only the rich could afford it. To make matters worse, it was easy to tax, as everything had to clear a port before final sale. In 1815 alone, the sugar tax accounted for £3 million in revenue. Consumers used locked containers to keep safe surplus supplies. But you needed some sugar if you wanted to manufacture or sell sweets. At the top of the market, this was no problem, as the rich could afford it, but there would be a price resistance at the lower end, and Bradford had more of the latter than the former. The sweet makers resorted to an old trick, beloved today of the modern drugs trade, that you could dilute it, hopefully with a neutral additive, but still give the unsuspecting consumer enough to satisfy their needs. They used the harmless byproduct of gypsum as part substitute for sugar. Everyone knew of this trick, and the products were called daff or flash. As long as everyone understood the process, nobody was ever the wiser. Bradford grew from a village of just over 4,500 people in 1780 to 163,000 in 1851 as a result of immigrants from Ireland and Germany. It is now the 8th biggest city in the United Kingdom. It was principally known for its involvement in the wool trade and was once described as the wool capital of the world. On the day in question, William Hardacre asked a friend to order some sweets from a local merchant called Joseph Neal. Hardacre ran a stall in Green Market in the centre of the city. He was known as Humbug Billy because he was a well-known purveyor of lozenges. They were popular with the public, as the peppermint flavour was thought by some to have a medicinal effect. He did not make the sweets himself, but relied on Joseph Neal to mix the concoction. Neal used the services of Charles Hodgson, a pharmacist based in Shipley, 3 miles from Bradford, to source his supplies. On the 18th of October, Neal was ill and told his apprentice, John Archer, to pick up the gypsum from the pharmacist. Ironically, Hodgson was on the premises but was also feeling unwell. He directed his apprentice, William Goddard, to attend to the client to weigh out and fetch the required ingredients. Goddard was unsure as to exactly where the gypsum was in the storeroom and had to ask his employer its whereabouts. Hodgson was not in the best of moods and directed his apprentice to find it in a cask in the cellar, where he would find the white powder was stored. Unfortunately, the cask Archer went to was the wrong one and contained arsenic trioxide rather than the gypsum. £12 of supposedly harmless white powder was handed to Joseph Neal's apprentice. At Joseph Neal's premises, the mixing of the sweets was given to another employee called John Appleton. The ingredients included 40 pounds of sugar, 12 pounds of gypsum, 4 pounds of gum, and 4 pounds of peppermint oil. The mix of the ingredients illustrates why it was so important to get the sugar-gypsum mixture right. The lozenge needed the right amount of sugar to sell the product, but not to waste excess amounts of it on the consumer, thus maximising the profit. Appleton mixed the deadly concoction and got ill on the arsenic fumes, which he thought was the result of a cold. Hardacre, on inspecting the sweets, noticed that the colouring was different from usual, which Neal explained was the result of using a new gum. The buyer demanded a discount, which he obtained, and got half a penny per pound off the price. The next stage was to sell the sweets. A customer named Mark Burren visited Humbug Billy's lozenge stall at Green Market and bought some and offered one each to two of his sons, 5-year-old Orlando and John, who was a toddler. It will come as no surprise that the two boys became violently ill. A local doctor, John Bell, was called to the house. At first he thought the boys were suffering from cholera, but later changed his mind to poisoning, and so the police were called. The boys died later that night in excruciating agony, as the anguished parents watched them suffer from diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. Since the tainted sweets had been bought from Humbug Willie's stall, the police were able to easily locate his address. On meeting him, they were surprised to discover that he too was unwell, presumably from eating his own lozenges. He pointed suspicion to Joseph Neal, who in turn revealed that he had bought the white powder from Hodgson's pharmacy in Shipley. Hodgson must have been horror-struck when he discovered that his apprentice, Goddard, had substituted harmless gypsum for the deadly arsenic. Both were white, tasteless and odourless. Easy mistake to make if none of the casks bore the correct labelling as to their contents. During that night, Bradford was experiencing a nightmare. 20 people, including several children, died of arsenic poisoning, and a further 200 were laid low through eating the contaminated sweets. The police went to all the local pubs to warn people, and bells were rung to notify the population of a major event. The condemned lozenges turned up as far away as Halifax and Bolton. Someone had to pay, if only to prevent a local lynch mob. Goddard was arrested and brought before local magistrates on the 1st of November. Later, the pharmacist Charles Hodgson and Joseph Neal were charged with manslaughter, but the charges against both of them were later dropped. Goddard was later cleared at York Assizes in December. It is impossible nowadays to comprehend the scale of the tragedy. A dangerous place like a pharmacist was left in the hands of an apprentice to not only serve a client, but pick up the materials from unmarked casks. He was dealing with an ill employer who should have been in bed rather than trying to keep the place open. So, why was nobody found guilty of manslaughter? Until there were new laws, you took your life into your own hands when entering a shop. Even if you bought the actual item, you had no legal rights, and this was only overturned in the last century, when a woman nearly died from worm poisoning when she drank the said worm from a ginger beer bottle. No one really wants to return to a situation where sellers could legitimately put sawdust in loaves of bread to increase its weight, or strychnine in beer to give it a more bitter taste, or see their own children die needlessly through the actions of others. But it is not just confectionery that can be affected. In 1900, more than 6,000 people in England were poisoned by arsenic-tainted beer, with more than 70 of those affected dying as a result. The illness was prevalent across the Midlands and northwest of England, with Manchester being the most heavily affected. Doctors were alarmed by the number of new patients suffering from what they misdiagnosed as alcoholic neuropathy, which is damage to the nervous system due to excessive consumption of alcohol. At first it was thought to be related to sulphur, which was used to treat hops for blight. The main epidemic was only recognised after several months. One patient returning from Canada even claimed that he was suffering from foot and mouth disease. It appeared that only beer drinkers suffered, and not those who consumed spirits. The amount of beer consumed by the public was huge. In Liverpool alone, the medical officer estimated that a population of 668,000 and the 2,223 public houses needed 1 million gallons of beer a week just to satisfy local demand. But it was not just heavy beer drinkers that were affected. In one case, a 2-year-old baby whose father ran a pub was suffering. It turned out that the child would be given sips of beer from kind customers. The cause of this mysterious outbreak was finally cracked by Dr. Ernest Reynolds. He noted that all the cases involved the symptoms of muscle paralysis, issues with their sensory nerves, and discoloration of the skin. He believed the last symptom did not arise from excessive amounts of alcohol, but rather exposure to arsenic poisoning. They appeared to be suffering from a type of virus which causes a skin rash. He bought some of the local beer, tested it, and this confirmed his theory. Investigation into the outbreak found other sources of arsenic in beer, which had been unknowingly poisoning thousands for decades preceding the outbreak. Now that the cause had been found, the medical profession were able to give their patients a small amount of morphine, diuretics, and lotions for skin itching and burning. Once the breweries affected were identified, investigation as to where the arsenic came from was instituted. It was found that it was present in sugar, used to aid fermentation, provided to the breweries by Bostock & Co. of Garston. To lower costs in the tight-margin English beer market, some breweries substituted high-quality barley malt with low-quality barley supplemented with sugar. This practice was somewhat controversial. As part of the pure beer movement, an inquiry on the use of brewing substitutes was called. This inquiry, starting in 1896 and ending in 1899, had concluded that brewing substitutes were not deleterious materials under the Sale of Food and Drugs Act 1875, and that further legislation was not required. This sugar was made by acid hydrolysis of starch, where starch is heated with sulphuric acid. Such a method was not new, and had been employed commercially since at least 1814. Bostock & Co. used sulphuric acid to perform the acid hydrolysis. This acid, purchased from Nicholson & Sons, was made from pyrites, which contained arsenic, which remained in the final product. John Nicholson & Sons of Leeds had provided sulphuric acid to Bostock & Co. since 1888. For most of the length of the business relationship, the goods provided were free from arsenic. In March 1900, Nicholson started supplying unpurified sulphuric acid containing arsenic. This practice continued until November, when the acid was found to be the cause of the outbreak. Nicholson claimed they did not know the nature of Bostock's use of the acid, and that they could have provided arsenic-free if requested. Once the main source of the outbreak had been identified as arsenic poisoning, further investigation into contamination of beer was undertaken. Eventually, it was found that arsenic was also introduced into beer by the malted barley. In the kilning stage of malting, the barley humidity content is reduced by drying the grain with the hot vapours of a fire, usually fueled by coke or coal. It was found that when arsenic is present in the fuel, it could then be deposited upon the barley before steeping, and therefore would be present in the final product. Investigation into the outbreak uncovered that most cases of alcoholic neuropathy epidemic to Manchester were, in fact, misdiagnosed arsenic poisoning, with this alternative route being responsible for the poisoning of thousands in the years preceding the outbreak. Bostock and Company went into liquidation and sued Nicholson and Sons for damages for breach of an implied condition under the Sale of Goods Act. The case was heard in the High Court. The judge awarded Bostock the price of the contaminated acid and the value of their spoiled products, but no damages for the loss of goodwill or for the damages claimed by the brewers, incurred by using the contaminated product in their sugars manufacture. Nicholson and Sons survived and was later acquired by a rival. The response from the brewing industry was mixed. Groves and Widnall poured 4,000 barrels of beer into the sewer, watched by customs and excise men. In addition, it levelled each new barrel, certifying its purity. Thurfalls destroyed 5,500 barrels in their cellars, as well as those of their publicans, and they sent telegrams to retailers in 40 towns, stopping them from selling the contaminated beer. Unfortunately, other breweries were not so scrupulous. Stone Brewery of Northampton were still sending their contaminated beer out to pubs, whilst a small brewery in Market Drayton offered fresh batches of decent beer, but took no action on the old contaminated brew. Even when breweries were diligent in stopping contaminated beer reaching the public, they were powerless to stop final sale. The North Cheshire Brewing Co. of Macclesfield disposed of 1,100 barrels down the sewer. They sent a circular to all their tenants not to sell any more cheap 4p per quart beers. Unfortunately, the landlady of the railway vaults, Mrs. Bannon, ignored the memo and continued to poison her clients. The local police inspector sent his daughter to buy a quart of the suspect brew. As a consequence, Mrs. Bannon was fined £10 and the brewery £30. The scandal lit up the need to avoid using sugar when brewing beer. As far back as 1516, Bavaria enacted a law called the German Purity Law, which stated that beer must only contain water, barley, hops, and yeast. But each year, despite increasing regulations, we have seen contaminated olive oil, antifreeze used in wine production, or horse meat in beef burgers, and the list goes on and on. It is only after a serious scandal that proper action is taken. In May 1964 in Aberdeen, in the north-east of Scotland, an employee of grocery store chain William Lowe in Union Street owned a tin of Frey Bentos corned beef and offered its customers the opportunity to purchase slices from it. The rest was put on display in a window of the shop. A few days later, a patient was sent to hospital with suspected typhoid, and eventually 507 cases from 309 households were admitted to various hospitals in the Aberdeen area. 3 people eventually died. The previous year, typhoid cases had broken out in Harlow, Bedford and South Shields. The government of the day in effect suppressed the news, and medical officers were not informed of this development. At first it was thought to be a virus carrier, or problems at the Co-op dairy plant, or the William Lowe shop, which had opened 8 months previously. Eventually, the shop was identified as the source of the outbreak. Later outbreaks resulted from other meats that had been sliced from the same machine in the shop. Between the 20th and the 23rd of May, the whole supermarket was cleared of produce by the Ministry of Health. As no member of staff had typhoid, then there had to be another explanation. This was provided by a laboratory in London, which confirmed that the strain of the disease was common in South America and Spain, but virtually unknown in Britain. The epidemic was eventually traced to contaminated tin corned beef from Rosario in Argentina and sold in the Aberdeen branch of William Lowe. Pollution from the waters of the Uruguay River appeared to be the source of the contamination, probably through water entering a defective tin through a small puncture. The infected meat then contaminated a meat slicing machine in the William Lowe shop, leading to the spread of the disease. The bacteria multiplied further in the meats as they were placed near a window and exposed to sunlight. One thing about this event is the role played by television. Dr. Ian McQueen, the medical officer of health for Aberdeen, became well known in the media for his twice-daily briefings. The doctor had a real dilemma on his hands. He knew that the cause of the outbreak was the William Lowe shop on Union Street, and estimated that thousands visited that shop every day. If each of these people plus their families visited their GPs, it would overwhelm the health service. An example of his advice to the public was that they were to avoid cream cakes, pre-cooked cold meats, lettuce and tomatoes that have not been grown in the garden, and anything that has been handled and cooked again. Schools were closed, although pubs stayed open. The locals were told not to go on holiday, and visitors not to go to the city, which was turning into a ghost town, as people would not visit each other or enter its environs. The outbreak drew attention to the need for better standards of hygiene, notably in the cleaning of food processing machinery. The University of Aberdeen went on to develop an international reputation in the field of disease control. Even today, we keep hearing about scandals in the food industry, from putting antifreeze in Austrian wine to contaminated olive oil from Spain. But the world has certainly moved a long way from such events like the Bradford sweet poisoning. The reputation of William Lowe was irrevocably damaged within Aberdeen, and the city's store, the source of the outbreak, closed for good 3 years later. They opened many other stores around Scotland, but remained absent from Aberdeen. The company was eventually taken over by Tesco in 1994. Public perceptions of the safety of Fray Bentos tinned meats also contributed to significantly diminished income.